You're standing in a room where 23 men are about to change the course of history, not with bullets, not with bombs, but with silence. June 6, 1944. While thousands prepared to storm Normandy's beaches, these men sat in a bunker beneath London, surrounded by maps, radios, and the weight of an impossible secret. They were the architects of Operation Fortitude, the greatest deception in military history. What if I told you that the D-Day invasion succeeded not because of what the Allies did, but because of what they didn't say? Picture this: an entire phantom army, inflatable tanks, fake radio traffic, Hollywood set designers creating illusions that would fool Nazi reconnaissance planes. General George Patton, America's most feared commander, leading absolutely nothing, commanding ghost divisions that existed only on paper and in German intelligence reports. The Germans had eyes everywhere: spies, aerial reconnaissance, radio interceptors. They were listening to every whisper, analyzing every movement. And that's exactly what the Allies were counting on. You see, sometimes the loudest statement is made in complete silence. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't what you reveal, it's what you conceal. These 23 men knew something that would make them physically ill to keep secret. They knew when, they knew where, they knew that hundreds of thousands of lives hung in the balance, and they knew that one word, one slip, one moment of weakness could unravel everything. Can you imagine carrying that burden, knowing that your silence could save lives, or your words could destroy them? They called it the need-to-know principle. Even Churchill's own cabinet didn't know the full truth. Even Allied generals were kept in the dark. The circle of knowledge was so small, so tight, that these men became prisoners of their own secret. But here's where it gets interesting. The enemy was listening, always listening, and the Allies knew it. Every morning at 0600 hours, Captain Dennis Wheatley would enter a nondescript building in central London. To anyone watching, he was just another bureaucrat, heading to another wartime office. But behind those walls, he was orchestrating the greatest magic trick ever performed. You've heard of magicians who make elephants disappear? Wheatley and his team were making entire armies appear out of thin air. They started with the 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, 1 million men strong. At least that's what German intelligence believed. In reality, it was Patton, a skeleton, crew of radio operators and props that would make a Hollywood studio jealous. Think about that for a moment. While real soldiers were training in complete secrecy along Britain's southern coast, the Germans were fixating on an army that didn't exist, positioned near Dover, pointed directly at Calais. The deception was breathtaking in its audacity. They built fake landing craft in Scottish harbors, not one or two, hundreds of them. From the air, German reconnaissance planes photographed what looked like a massive invasion fleet. Up close, canvas and wood, floating on oil drums. But silence alone wasn't enough. They had to fill that silence with carefully crafted noise. Radio operators worked around the clock, sending fake messages. Request 10,000 K rations for 3rd Division. Fuel supplies running low, need immediate resupply. Each transmission meticulously planned, each one a thread in an elaborate tapestry of deception. You know what's remarkable? The Germans weren't fools. Their intelligence services were sophisticated, paranoid, and extremely effective. Rommel himself, the Desert Fox, was in charge of defending the Atlantic Wall. This was a man who could read battlefields like others read books. Yet they believed it. They believed it because the silence was perfect. Here's what silence meant in practical terms. When a soldier went on leave and got drunk in a London pub, he couldn't tell his sweetheart where he'd been training. When officers wrote letters home, censors blacked out entire paragraphs. When workers in factories across Britain produced materials for the invasion, they had no idea what they were building or why. An entire nation held its breath. An entire nation kept a secret. But the real heroes of this silence? They were the double agents, men and women who lived every day knowing that one mistake meant death, and that their lies were keeping hundreds of thousands alive. His name was Juan Pujol Garcia, but history knows him by his codename, Garbo. A Spanish chicken farmer who hated fascism so much, he created an entirely fictional spy network that the Germans believed was real. You want to know how powerful silence can be? This one man, sitting in a small room in London, convinced Nazi Germany that he had 27 sub-agents feeding him information. Not one of them existed. Garbo would send radio messages to his German handlers. Detailed reports about troop, movements, supply shipments, invasion preparations, all fake, all carefully crafted to support the grand illusion. The Germans trusted him so completely they awarded him the Iron Cross. The British gave him an MBE. He's the only person to receive decorations from both sides in World War II. But here's where silence becomes art. Garbo had to report something about D-Day. The Germans expected it. So on June 6th at 3 a.m., just hours before the invasion, he sent an urgent message warning that Normandy was the target, too late to matter, but early enough to enhance his credibility. You see what happened there? Even breaking silence became part of the silence. Even the truth became a lie. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, German forces waited, 15 divisions held in reserve near Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. Waiting because silence had convinced them to wait. Think about the psychology of it. Every German commander knew an invasion was coming. They could feel it in their bones. The question was where? And in that uncertainty, in that deafening silence from the Allies, they projected their own fears. Calais made sense. It was the shortest distance across the Channel. It offered the quickest route to Berlin. It's where any reasonable military strategist would attack. And that's exactly why the Allies chose Normandy. But maintaining this silence required sacrifice. Real sacrifice. Resistance members in France who knew about Normandy were ordered to continue their operations around Calais. Some were captured. Under torture, they revealed nothing about Normandy, because they knew nothing. Their ignorance, carefully maintained by Allied silence, may have saved the invasion. You're starting to see the pattern, aren't you? Silence wasn't passive. It was active. It was a weapon that required constant vigilance, incredible discipline, and acceptance that some would die to maintain it. May 28, 1944, 9 days before D-Day. In a quiet room in Portsmouth, General Dwight D. Eisenhower sat across from a man who had just become one of the most dangerous people in Britain. Not because of what he might do, but because of what he knew. The man was a telegraph operator. During a routine inspection, he'd accidentally seen classified invasion plans. Maps, dates, everything. What do you do with someone who knows too much? In Stalin's Russia, the answer was simple. But this was different. This was about trust. About believing that ordinary people could carry extraordinary secrets. Eisenhower made a choice that day. He looked that telegraph operator in the eye and said, "Son, the fate of the free world is in your hands now." Then he sent him back to work. That man kept his silence. Even after the war, he rarely spoke of what he'd seen. He understood something profound, that his silence was his contribution to victory. But not everyone could handle the pressure. On May 30th, Major General Henry Miller, after a few drinks at Claridge's Hotel, mentioned to fellow diners that the invasion would come before June 15th. Within hours, he was arrested, demoted, and sent back to the United States in disgrace. One moment of weakness. One broken silence. Career destroyed. You think that's harsh? Consider this. German intelligence had agents everywhere. In hotels, in restaurants, among the serving staff. Every careless word was a potential death sentence. For soldiers on beaches they'd never seen. The pressure was crushing people, literally. A British colonel, overcome by the weight of what he knew, suffered a nervous breakdown and had to be hospitalized under guard. They couldn't risk him talking, in his delirium. Meanwhile, the deception continued to evolve. Operation Fortitude wasn't just about creating fake armies. It was about creating an entire fake timeline. The Allies leaked information suggesting the invasion wouldn't come until late July. They arranged for diplomatic communications to reference August preparations. They even had agricultural experts publicly discuss the need to wait for better weather conditions. Every lie required 10 truths to support it. Every deception demanded perfect silence from thousands who knew better. And through it all, the clock was ticking. Each day brought new challenges, new opportunities for the secret to leak, new moments when silence might break. You want to know what silence sounds like in war? It sounds like Corporal Peter Masters, born Peter Arani in Vienna, now serving in British intelligence. A Jewish refugee who'd fled the Nazis, now helping to deceive them. Masters was part of a special unit tasked with creating noise, fake radio traffic to support the Phantom armies. 8 hours a day, he sat in a cramped room, sending meaningless messages that meant everything. Supply convoy delayed due to mechanical failure. Request immediate medical supplies for training accident. Ammunition expenditure higher than expected. During exercises, each message carefully scripted, each one part of a larger symphony of deception. But here's what made it brilliant. They included real problems, real delays, real accidents. Because the best lies are mostly truth. The Germans intercepted these messages. Of course they did. That was the point. Their intelligence analysts spent countless hours studying patterns, trying to divine truth from fiction. They never realized it was all fiction wrapped in truth's clothing. But maintaining this illusion required more than fake messages. It required real silence from real people. In the factories of Birmingham and Manchester, workers produced specialized equipment for the invasion. They didn't know what they were making. Supervisors had orders to fire anyone who asked too many questions. Curiosity became a liability. On the southern coast of England, entire villages were evacuated. Residents forced from homes their families had occupied for generations. They were told it was for training exercises. They weren't told which exercises or why. They left in silence. They waited in silence. You know what's heartbreaking? Some of those villagers had sons in the military, sons who were training for D-Day, parents and children, separated by miles and secrets, neither knowing the other's role in history. The American soldiers arriving in Britain, over 2 million of them by June 1944, were briefed on operational security until their eyes glazed. Over. Loose lips sink ships wasn't just a catchy phrase, it was gospel. But humans aren't designed for this kind of silence. We're social creatures. We share. We connect. We communicate. Asking millions to stop doing what makes them human, that was the real challenge. So they found ways to maintain morale while maintaining silence. Soldiers wrote letters home filled with mundane details. The food is terrible. It rains all the time. I miss your apple pie. Nothing about where they were. Nothing about what they were training for. Just enough connection to stay sane. The psychological toll was immense. Divorce rates spiked. Soldiers couldn't explain their absences, couldn't share their fears, couldn't prepare their families for what might come. One soldier wrote in his diary, "I feel like I'm already dead, a ghost who can't speak to the living." He survived D-Day, but that feeling of isolation, of carrying unspeakable truths, that haunted him forever. June 3rd, 1944. 3 days before history pivots. In a secure compound outside London, the architects of silence gathered for what they knew might be their last meeting. These weren't generals or admirals. These were the shadow warriors, the ones whose names you'll never find in history books. They'd spent 2 years building the greatest lie ever told. Now they had 72 hours to make sure it held. Colonel David Strangeways, head of deception operations, looked exhausted. He'd been awake for 3 days straight, monitoring German radio intercepts. "They're still convinced about Calais," he reported. "But Rommel is getting nervous. He's requesting permission to move the 15th Army." This was the moment of maximum danger. If the Germans repositioned their forces now even slightly, hundreds of thousands could die. The response? More silence. But targeted silence. They activated their deepest assets. Double agents across Europe suddenly went quiet. Radio traffic from the phantom armies ceased. It was the communications equivalent of holding your breath. The Germans noticed, immediately. In Berlin, intelligence analysts worked frantically. What did this silence mean? Was it the calm before the storm? Were the Allies experiencing problems? Had their spy networks been compromised? You see the genius? By going silent, they created more noise than any deception could. The Germans' own. Paranoia filled the void with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. But here's what those German analysts didn't know. At that very moment, 150,000 Allied soldiers were boarding ships. The largest armada in human history was assembling in ports across southern England, and not one word of it reached German intelligence. How do you hide 7,000 ships? How do you conceal the movement of 3 million people? You don't. You can't. Instead, you hide them in plain sight. You make the enemy look everywhere except where they should. On June 4th, weather forced a delay. Eisenhower faced an impossible decision. Every hour increased the chance of discovery. Ships were loaded, men were ready, and somewhere, somehow, someone might talk. The meteorologist promised a brief window of acceptable weather on June 6th. It wasn't ideal. It was barely adequate. But it was better than watching their perfect silence slowly crumble. That night, as rain lashed against windows across southern England, a BBC radio operator prepared to broadcast the most important messages of the war. Coded phrases that would alert the French resistance. The long sobs of the violins of autumn wound my heart with a monotonous languor. To most listeners, it was poetry, meaningless culture in wartime. To those who knew, it was the breaking of silence. The signal that tomorrow everything would change. Across the channel, German soldiers played cards in their bunkers. Officers attended a war game exercise in Rennes. Rommel himself was in Germany, celebrating his wife's birthday. They all believed they had time. Silence had bought that time. Silence had created that complacency. Silence was about to win the... For June 6, 1944. In the churning waters of the English Channel, Sergeant William Hart tried to keep his breakfast down. Around him, 150,000 men faced the same battle. Not against Germans, against their own stomachs and their own need to speak. You know what's terrifying? It's not the waiting. It's the silence of the waiting. Hart's unit had been briefed just hours before. After months of training, they finally knew their target: Omaha Beach. The men absorbed this information without comment. No cheers, no complaints. Just acceptance and continued silence. But inside their heads? That's where the noise was deafening, Hart later wrote. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell someone, anyone, that I was about to die on a beach I'd never heard of. I wanted to call my mother. Instead, I cleaned my rifle for the 10th time. At 0300, coded messages crackled across Allied radios. The invasion was on. But, even now, at the moment of truth, silence remained crucial. Radio operators maintained strict discipline. No unnecessary chatter. No last-minute confessions. Meanwhile, in German headquarters across Normandy, confusion reigned. Paratroopers were reported behind the lines. But where was the main invasion? Scattered reports came in. Bombing at Calais, naval activity near Normandy, sabotage in Brittany. The German command structure, designed for efficiency, became its own worst enemy. Junior officers, trained never to act without orders, waited for clarity that wouldn't come. Senior officers, convinced the real invasion would come at Calais, dismissed Normandy as a diversion. At 0400, General Hans Speidel, Rommel's chief of staff, received urgent reports of Allied paratroopers. His response? No special countermeasures are required at this time. He went back to bed. You understand what happened? Silence had created a psychological framework. The Germans couldn't believe Normandy was the main invasion because months of silence had convinced them otherwise. Even with Allied soldiers literally falling from their skies, they clung to the fiction that silence had created. By 0500, the naval bombardment began. The silence broke with the thunder of 1,000 guns, but even then German command hesitated. This had to be the diversion. The real invasion would come at Calais. It had to. Everything they'd learned, everything their intelligence suggested, pointed to Calais. 15 German divisions waited near Calais, waited while their comrades at Normandy faced the full might of Allied fury, waited because silence had told them to wait. On Omaha Beach, Sergeant Hart's landing craft approached the shore. The naval bombardment had stopped. For a moment, there was silence again. The calm before hell. Then the ramps dropped. What followed was anything but silent. Machine guns, mortars, screaming men, screaming metal. The carefully maintained silence of months shattered in seconds of unimaginable violence. But here's the tragic irony. Even as men died on those beaches, the deception continued. Radio operators with the phantom armies increased their traffic. Double agents reported massive movements toward Calais. The lie outlived many of those who died to protect it. By noon, Allied forces had secured several beachheads. The German response remained paralyzed by indecision. Hitler, convinced this was still a feint, refused to release the armored reserves. Silence had done its job, perhaps too well. You want to know the cost of silence? Ask Lieutenant Marie Dubois of the French Resistance. She knew about Normandy 3 weeks before D-Day. A British agent, parachuted into France, had needed her network's help to scout the beaches. For 3 weeks she carried death in her head. The Gestapo arrested her neighbor, then her cousin. The interrogations were happening 2 blocks from her safe house. She could hear the screams at night. She knew that one word about Normandy would save them. One word would end their torture. She said nothing. Her cousin died under interrogation on June 4th, never knowing that his sacrifice helped ensure the invasion's success. Never knowing that Marie could have saved him with a word she refused to speak. After the war, Marie never spoke of those 3 weeks. When asked about her service, she'd changed the subject. Some silences outlive their purpose. Some silences become permanent. But the machinery of deception ground on, indifferent to individual tragedy. Even as Allied forces pushed inland from Normandy, Operation Fortitude continued. The phantom armies had to remain believable. The Germans had to keep believing Calais was still threatened. On June 7th, one day after D-Day, Juan Pujol, Agent Garbo, sent his most audacious message yet. He reported that the Normandy invasion was indeed a diversion. The real invasion would come at Calais within days. He urged the Germans to hold their reserves. Incredibly, they believed him. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, supreme commander of German forces in the West, kept the 15th Army at Calais. For 7 crucial weeks after D-Day, those divisions waited for an invasion that existed only in carefully crafted silence. Think about that. 7 weeks. While real battles raged in Normandy, while the fate of Europe hung in the balance, 200,000 German soldiers guarded against ghosts. But maintaining this illusion extracted its price. Allied pilots flew dangerous missions over Calais, dropping bombs on empty fields to simulate preparation for invasion. Some were shot down. Men died to perpetuate a lie that had already served its purpose. You know what's maddeningly brilliant? The Allies couldn't stop the deception too quickly. If the phantom armies suddenly disappeared, the Germans would realize they'd been fooled. Future deceptions would become impossible. So the charade continued. Radio operators kept transmitting. Double agents kept lying. Men kept dying. All to preserve the power of future silence. By late July, the breakout from Normandy was complete. Allied armies raced across France. The liberation of Paris beckoned. And still, German forces waited at Calais. When they finally realized the truth, German officers were devastated. Not just by the military defeat, but by the psychological blow. They'd been so thoroughly deceived that they questioned everything, every intelligence report, every assumption, every decision. Colonel Alexis von Rohen, head of German military intelligence in the West, was later executed for his role in the intelligence failure. But documents found after the war revealed the truth. He'd done his job perfectly. He'd simply been outplayed by silence. August 25, 1944. Paris liberated. The champagne flowed on the Champs-Élysées. But in a quiet office in London, the architects of silence were already burning their files. 2 million documents. 2 years of deceptions. Names of agents, details of operations. All of it fed to the flames. Even in victory, silence had to be maintained. You see, they understood something profound. Wars end. Enemies become allies. Allies become enemies. But the techniques of silence? Those are eternal. Those had to be protected. Many of the men and women who'd crafted Operation Fortitude would go on to work in the Cold War. The phantom armies of World War II became the blueprint for decades of deception between superpowers. The lessons of silence echo through history. But what about the human cost? What about those who carried these secrets? Captain Dennis Wheatley, the mastermind of the Phantom Armies, never wrote about his wartime service. His family didn't learn the truth until after his death. He'd spent 40 years changing the subject, 40 years maintaining operational security for a war-long one. Juan Pujol, Garbo, disappeared after the war, faked his own death, moved to Venezuela. The greatest double agent in history became a gift shop manager, anonymous and silent, until a historian tracked him down in the 1980s. You want to know why? Because silence becomes habit. Because once you learn to live with secrets, normal conversation feels like betrayal. The telegraph operator Eisenhower had trusted? He kept his word, took his secret to the grave. His children found his diary after he died. One entry, dated June 5, 1944. Tomorrow, history. Tonight, silence. But here's what's beautiful about their sacrifice. The very fact that we can tell these stories now means their silence achieved its purpose. They guarded their secrets long enough for those secrets to become history rather than intelligence. In 1974, 30 years after D-Day, the British government finally declassified parts of Operation Fortitude. Veterans who'd spent 3 decades deflecting questions could finally speak. Most chose not to. The habit of silence had become stronger than the need for recognition. One veteran, asked why he'd never told his story, replied, "What was there to tell? I sent fake messages about units that didn't exist." Others stormed beaches. They're the heroes. But he was wrong. In a war where information was ammunition, silence was courage. Every kept secret was a life saved. Every maintained deception was a battle won without bloodshed. The final accounting of Operation Fortitude is staggering. Historians estimate it saved 15,000 Allied lives on D-Day alone. By keeping German reserves at Calais, it shortened the war by months, maybe years, all because a few hundred people mastered the art of strategic silence. All because millions more accepted ignorance as duty. All because an entire generation understood that sometimes the greatest service you can render is to shut up. Here's what they don't tell you about D-Day in the movies. Yes, brave men stormed beaches. Yes, paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines. Yes, rangers scaled impossible cliffs. But the reason many of them lived to tell about it? Silence. The silence of a Spanish chicken farmer who created imaginary spies. The silence of radio operators who sent meaningless messages with life-or-death precision. The silence of a telegraph operator who glimpsed invasion plans and said nothing. The silence of French resistance fighters who died rather than reveal what they knew. The silence of millions who suspected, who guessed, who might have known, and kept quiet. You live in an age where secrets last seconds, where information travels at light speed, where silence is almost impossible. But that makes their achievement more remarkable, not less. They proved that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, that discipline can defeat technology, that patience can overcome power, that silence, properly wielded, can speak louder than any bomb. What if they'd failed? What if someone had talked? German reinforcements would have been waiting at Normandy. The beaches would have become slaughterhouses. The invasion might have failed. The war could have dragged on for years. Millions more might have died. Instead, silence won. Not the silence of cowardice or indifference. The silence of purpose. The silence of sacrifice. The silence of people who understood that their words could kill and chose not to speak. There's a memorial at Bletchley Park for the code breakers who helped win the war. But there's no memorial for those who kept silent. No monument to sealed lips. No statue to swallowed words. Their memorial is the world they helped create. A world where their children could speak freely because they chose not to. So the next time you're trusted with a secret, any secret, remember them. Remember that silence can be service, that discretion can be heroism, that sometimes the most important thing you can say is nothing at all. Remember that on June 6, 1944, while brave men died on French beaches, other brave men and women sat in offices and factories and homes across Britain, carrying secrets that could have changed everything. And they said nothing. Remember that wars are won not just by those who fight, but by those who know when not to speak. Remember that silence, when the stakes are highest, is not just golden. It's victory. History is written by the victors, they say. But sometimes history is written by those who choose not to write, not to speak, not to break. Those who understand that in the symphony of war, the rests are as important as the notes. That in the chess game of nations, the unmoved piece can checkmate kings. They mastered the hardest discipline of all. Not action, but inaction. Not speech, but silence. And they won the war because of it. Like the video, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. This channel is for those who believe history is made not only by armies, but by individual courage. Do you have family members who served in intelligence during World War II? What stories did they take to their graves? What silences did they keep? Share in the comments, because their untold stories deserve to be remembered, even if the details must remain forever silent.